This was one of those great interviews where, although you've just met the person you're having the conversation with, right from the start, you feel great hanging out with them. Douglas Beam, who works for a global online academy, was so clearly comfortable living as his authentic self that David and I instantly felt a connection with him. You might even say he made us feel like we belonged in the space we were in. Speaking for myself, I could have chatted for hours. Douglas has been a teacher and leader in schools in Europe, Asia, and North America, and currently works, as I said, at GOA as Associate Director of Member School Engagement. His leadership has focused on collaborative program building, curriculum development, school policy, and pastoral care. Douglas is passionate about fostering a sense of belonging in schools for all students. Douglas earned a doctorate in education from the University of New England, where his dissertation focused on a sense of belonging in international schools for gender and sexual minority students. Douglas lives in Ohio with his husband and their twin boys. Our guiding question was, what does it mean to experience a sense of belonging in an international school environment, and how can we, as teachers, best support our students in developing theirs? Here are some of the topics we covered: a definition of belonging, factors that nurture belonging, ways students in elementary, middle, and high school would describe their sense of belonging, how an identity as an international student differs from an identity as a student in a person's home country, the positive and negative forces affecting international students as they develop their identities. School leaders and teachers can implement programs and strategies to improve the environments inside as well as outside the classroom to support student well-being in terms of feeling supported and connected to others. And we heard a few highlights from Douglas's dissertation on gender and sexual minorities in our schools. This show was recorded on February 16th, 2024. Welcome to this space as we chat with the very kind and compassionate Douglas Beam.
Hello, Douglas. We're so excited to have you on the show and to come in and share some expertise with us. So welcome, and where in the world are you?
Well, thank you for having me, David and Audrey. My current location is in Dayton, Ohio. So it's actually not far from where I grew up in a town called Xenia, Ohio. But Dayton, if you don't know it, we live about 2 blocks from where the Wright brothers lived after they flew their plane in North Carolina. But Ohio claims them very strongly. And this Dayton area is one that there's a lot of aviation going on around here.
Well, as a fellow from Carolina and Virginia, we have our claim there as well
You do,
on the
definitely.
Outer Banks, but we can share. We can share for sure. All right. Well, do you have a going global story for us?
Yeah, I think I have two because one of them's heavily related to international schools and talking about just the recruiting process and how I jumped into it. But I think the first one is just more like how small the world is. And when I was in middle school, I had a really inspiring language teacher who taught French, and so I decided when I was in 10th grade that I wanted to be an exchange student for my 11th grade year. So I spent my entire junior year in high school abroad in the Rotary Foreign Exchange Program, which, if you're familiar with the Rotary Club, it's an incredible organization that sets up exchanges all over the world. And so I got to spend my entire year abroad. One of the really cool things that the Rotary did while I was studying was they brought all of the foreign exchange students together in France who were studying at that time. And we had a great time. We did some meetings and also went on trips together. And it was super exciting. And then I went back, finished high school in Xenia, and I went to a really small university in Indiana in the middle of a cornfield. Like nobody goes to this university. It's really teeny tiny. And I remember going to visit that university as I was like checking out, where did I want to go to school? This particular university has a really good music program and I was going to study music. But I remember walking down the sidewalk outside the music building and I saw walking toward me another person who had been an exchange student 2 years prior. And like, it was one of those, it was almost cartoon like because we kind of both walked past each other and then turned around and went, "Hey, wait a second. The last time I saw you was in France. And what are you doing here?"
I know you.
Yeah, I know you. Where did you come? And so just a chance to reconnect with somebody else. And I don't know, to me, it illustrates the world is so big, and then you have these human connections that make it seem so small. And I think that's definitely true for the international teaching world, because if you're in it for more than even a couple of years, you know that you connect with people all around the world, and you keep having those same connections. And oh, do you know, and have you met, and have you worked with, and have you been to, and those connections just keep forming and forming. And that's one of the really awesome things and humanizing things too about working in international schools. For me, going global happened really quickly. When I was teaching in public school in the US, on a Monday, I found out that my school was downsizing, my district was downsizing, and I was likely to lose my job. On a Tuesday, I got an email from somebody that I was in grad school with who had been at an international school in India. And I remember hearing stories from her of like how incredible the experience was and what are some of the cool things that she got to do with her students. And then on Wednesday, I found out I was losing my job in public school. On Thursday, I applied for the job in India. On Friday, they interviewed me. And on Saturday, I decided to go to India as a
Wow.
25-year-old.
Wow.
Yeah, so it happened. And then on Sunday, I called my mom and said, hey, hey, I'm going to move to India. And I kid you not, her response was, yeah, that sounds about right.
No, that's awesome. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for the stories. And honestly, that is wonderful. That led beautifully into our topic for today, which is belonging and, those encounters and connections. And we've said it 100 times that this world of international education, the world itself is huge. This world feels small and
Yeah.
it feels like community. And really, I found very quickly that I felt like I belonged because I went to Ethiopia, and this was 30 years ago. So phone calls were $3 a minute
Yes.
and no internet or any such. So your communication was mostly by letter, which took 2 weeks each way. And suffice it to say, I've told this story before on this show, that it felt even more of a leap of faith than maybe it would today with being able to communicate more. But I got there and I was met by the
Mhm.
principal and brought to the house of another young teacher who had just arrived, who was also Canadian, and spent the afternoon with her and honestly felt instantly that sense of community and belonging. So let's see where our topic today takes us. It's more about, I think, students than teachers, but I feel as though there's a lot of sense of belonging in the international teaching sphere for educators.
Absolutely. I think that belonging is not just a need that students feel, it's one that we all feel as humans. It's something definitely that makes us human. And so sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about belonging for our students in our schools, but it relates to us too, and whether or not we feel like we belong in the places where we are teaching and living.
And that's true. And it just made me think that it probably is going to come up today that if the teachers feel a sense of belonging and community in a school, it will translate into how the kids feel too. So let's get into our guiding question. What does it mean to experience a sense of belonging in an international school environment? And how can we as teachers best support our students in developing theirs? And we'll start by asking some more granular questions, starting with broadly defining what it means for human beings to feel a sense of belonging. What do you think, Douglas?
Yeah, just in that story that you told, Audrey, a couple of things really stuck out to me about your experience, showing up at a new place. And two things that you mentioned specifically were the people that you encountered and the space that you were in, that you got invited to somebody's house. And those things contributed to your sense of belonging. So I think maybe one of the first things for us to sort of lay as the foundation for any discussion about sense of belonging is we're talking about something social here. It's about how we relate to other people. And so I think to some extent it can be helpful for us to also, as we hold sort of belonging in one hand and talk about that, we can also sort of, in the other hand, talk about what it's like when you don't feel like you belong and you feel things like being alone or being in isolation or being bullied or not having particularly high quality relationships with your peers or your colleagues. Those things on one side are detrimental to a sense of belonging. And so, if you want to think about belonging, then I think the first thing that comes to mind is what kind of relationships do you have with the people who share space with you? And is there a place for you to have those relationships and to relate to other people? So, space and time are both key components to developing and feeling a sense of belonging. And two things come to mind as I sort of think about that. One of them is the experience that my family is having right now. After being in international schools and working in India for 6 years and then working in the Netherlands for 9 years, we've moved back to the US. And I'm coming to you from Dayton, Ohio. For my kids who are 12, I've got twin boys that are 12 years old. They've never experienced living in the United States before. I don't think that we're done teaching in or working in international schools, but for now we're located in the US. And part of that is to give them the experience of figuring out for them what it's like to live in the United States, also to give them the experience of being close to family. But as we made that transition in this past year, one of the first places where my kids felt a sense of belonging was in the group of kids that they were playing soccer with. They would go to soccer practices on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They had an immediate group of friends who were sharing a space and a time with them and an activity. And they had instant connections and instant friends. And that really helped ease the transition for them, but also helped them feel like, hey, I belong in this space. Just as much as I belonged in my soccer club in Europe when I was playing there, I belong in this place here. And that was a great help for them over the course of the transition. I work with a group of students who go to international schools around the world now. And a few months back, I was having a conversation with a student who is in a math class online and connecting with other math students around the world. And these are particularly high flying math students doing the kinds of math that I only dream of doing sometimes. And she said to me, in this math class and in connecting with people around the world, she found her people. She found the people who love the thing that she loves and is able to connect with them in ways that she can't connect to people in her home school. And I think that that's really interesting because, she goes to school to a brick and mortar place, but she found her people online. And that was the place and space and time she needed in order to create a sort of sense of connection and form high quality relationships with her peers. So I think that place and time can look different in a bunch of different circumstances and given, who you are and where you are in the world. But that sort of social underpinning that you have to have a space for it and you have to have time for it is a great way to start to understand sense of belonging and what it means for us. Secondly, I think we can get into a conversation sort of academically, like how has belonging been defined in research and literature? And this goes back. I think sometimes people think that belonging or really any DEIB work is kind of what's happening now and is maybe just sort of a passing trend. And the studies on belonging have been around for, almost 70 years. When you go back to Maslow and hierarchy of needs and thinking about what needs we have as humans. But then even since the 90s, when that academic literature was really supplemented, people have been defining and trying to figure out what it is that makes somebody feel like they belong in a school or other situations and circumstances. So some of the more common definitions of belonging: feeling valued, feeling accepted at school. One of my favorite ones is feeling accepted, respected, included, and supported in school. So a positive sense of belonging is attributed to all kinds of fantastic outcomes for school, like lower absenteeism, motivation, increased motivation, improved health, improved well-being markers. But in general, it comes down to how you are allowed to show up in a community and how that community responds to you. Do you feel accepted, respected, included, and supported by the people that you are around?
Mm, yes, that is really connecting a lot of dots in my mind too. Can I just ask you to clarify? I believe you said DEIB. I'm not
Mhm.
familiar with the B part. What I usually hear is DEIJ. Could you clarify that for me, please?
I hear both ways.
Okay.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as the B in that acronym.
Okay. That's interesting. The inclusion seems like belonging already to me, so that sounds a little redundant. So I'm curious about where that comes from. That's interesting.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that both conversations are important and they're a little bit different because
Okay.
there are places, for example, where you might be able to cultivate a high sense of belonging with a very narrow group of people. And so it points to me to something about a sort of different question of who's included and who's invited to show up in a space versus who feels like they belong in a space. And I think in particular about my family's is two men and then we have two kids. So we're a gay couple with children. And the fact that we are a gay couple with children limits the places in the world, speaking of international schools, where we can go work. So I'm not invited to show up in certain spaces because of my identity, because of who I am, because of who I'm married to, and because of the structure of my family. I've had it suggested to me by school administrators who would like me to come work for them that, oh, well, if one of you just gives up your parental rights
No.
and the other one accepts full responsibility for both children and they're on the visa and the other one accepts not being on the visa, then you can come work at our school, no problem. And yeah, that actually is a little bit of a problem for me and for my family. And I don't think in a lot of cases you would be having a similar conversation if you were talking to a heterosexual family. So I think parsing out what's an issue of inclusion and what's an issue of belonging, there is some difference and some daylight between the two.
Thank you for explaining that. And that really helps to establish our topic, which is
Yeah.
what is belonging. So that's great. Thank you.
Now, that said, they go hand in hand. And I think you are absolutely right to question what's the difference between the two and whether or not there is an appreciable difference between the two. I think the two walk hand in hand with each other because I can imagine situations where you could point to, like, is this an issue of inclusion and who are inviting to show up in this place? But then following up that question with, okay, the people that we are inviting to show up in this space, do they feel like they belong here? And sometimes I think back over the course of the 15 years I've spent in international schools and then, over 20 years in education. And I think about some of the learners that we have who we've invited to show up in schools, but then haven't been exactly equipped to make them feel like they belong. And one of those particular areas would be those with learning differences and those who are neurodivergent. Sometimes we invite people, we say, yes, come on, come into this space, but then teachers, administrators, programs aren't equipped to deal with the needs that those people have and support them in the way they show up to school.
Yeah, you're making a lot of sense there. I'm starting to really understand the difference, and it would be great to have Lori Bull on again and talk about the whole belonging piece from the perspective of Senya and
Yeah.
inclusion in the sense of the neurodivergent learners. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm going to connect on that one. You took the words out of my mouth. When I was in grad school many decades ago studying gifted education, the Renzulis did a lot of research and work on how to support those students. But one of the biggest takeaways for me as a counselor was the social. How much these students often felt they did not belong. And in the rest of my career, I was always a voice for gifted kids who were often just said, oh, they can handle it. It's okay. Academically, and I'd say no. And then they say socially, maybe they struggle. Well, what are we doing about that? How are we bringing them together? How are we helping them feel welcome? And how are we helping them connect to each other? So fortunately, I was at a school where it was upper elementary, and the gifted kids were scattered among the classes, but we had an incredible gifted coordinator who used technology to bring these kids together for them to say, hey, I'm not alone. I'm with other kids who are like me. And so it really helped them out a lot. So I'm glad you brought that up. And we're going to get into different populations as we go through this conversations. And we're going to get at some strategies to help people be in a better position to take different perspectives and to try to understand what it's like to come in and not feel welcome, as you were saying. So let's go to our next question. This really is something I'm very interested in when it comes to wellness. And what does it mean to have an elementary student describe how they're well, or a middle school student describing how they have good well being? But let's talk about specific ways, and let's divide it up. Elementary student, a middle school student, and a high school student would describe their sense of belonging. And I know we're generalizing, and it does come down to the individual or maybe the attributes of the group that they're a part of. But can you give that a shot?
Yeah, and I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about both thinking of belonging and the functions of space and time. And so, in each of those sort of three age groups, elementary, middle, and high school, how are we making time and how are we making space for each of those people to feel accepted, respected, included, and supported? The framework sort of stays the same, but the evidence might look a little bit different at each grade level. So, thinking about elementary school in particular, the connection that they have with other students, and what do healthy peer relationships look like in elementary school? You can imagine a setting where there's a lot of imaginative play happening, where students are interacting with each other, both in structured and unstructured ways, and then able to form strong relationships with adults too. And actually, before I gloss over that statement, let me just pause there for a second, because I think one of the things that we're going to see as a through line at any age is the student relationship with the teacher. And there's a lot of research that suggests strongly that the variable that has the most impact on whether or not a student feels a sense of belonging in school is the quality of the teacher-student relationship. And so, is the teacher-student relationship positive, and is it agency promoting? And I think if you could have a host of experts on elementary, middle school, and high school to talk about, agency and student, what that looks like at each individual level. But I think a commonality between the three of them is, do the students feel like they have the ability to impact their own education? Are the decisions that they're making having an effect on what they learn and how? Or, to put it, I think, sort of simply, maybe to oversimplify, is their education something that's being done to them or being something done by them? And that is an important feeling, I think, David. If you're talking about the gifted students that you worked with, sometimes, yeah, we exclude those students and saying, oh, well, they don't need any support from us. But I think in sort of isolating them, we also remove some agency of they get to determine what happens to them and what their education is like. And that can be said for, I think, any number of groups of students too. That isolation removes agency. And then it might lessen the impact that they feel like they can have, that they can make through their own decisions about what they learn and how. Having that agency does have an impact on whether or not you feel like you belong in a certain space. Academically, there's a little bit of conversation about academic fit. And is this the right fit for me? And fit is a really interesting word, because sometimes fit is used as a gatekeeping word to say, oh, this person doesn't fit in our community, so they're not meant to be here. And we can explore that, because sometimes that language can be a little bit coded. For fit doesn't mean necessarily that they shouldn't be here, but that they don't necessarily look like us or talk like us or act like us. And so we say they don't fit in order to have a reason to exclude them. But for academic fit, do you have the capacity to deal with the challenges that your academic situation is presenting you? So that took us a little bit off topic. I want to let me loop back around to the question, which was, what does this look like? This sort of sense of belonging in elementary, middle, and high school. And so we talked a little bit about elementary, and what are some social interactions there, and what does that look like? Thinking about middle school and some of the social and academic tendencies of middle schoolers, we talk a lot about exploratory models of middle school and how people are figuring out what their interests are. And so that, to me, relates back to the idea of what are the different places that we're developing for students to key into emerging interests that they have as they develop their identities. And I know identity is a topic that we'll talk about a little bit more as we continue this discussion, but as they are forming those identities, Do they have various spaces where they feel like they can belong? And then later on in high school, as they've developed more independence, as they are navigating in and out of various academic and social settings, do they have good metrics and barometers for understanding how their own relationships with their peers, what those healthy boundaries are, what are healthy indicators of relationships? Do we have conversations with adults and between adults and students about what healthy relationships look like in high school? And then also, sort of academically, do they have multiple varied places where they can dig into interests of their own that they've developed? And do they have places where they feel like, oh yeah, academically I feel like I fit here, I fit in? So belonging, I think it shares a lot of that sort of underpinning framework that it remains social, it remains about identity throughout elementary, middle, and high school, but then looks different at each of those different ages.
Thank you for sharing those differences. I think it would be really helpful if teachers were aware of some of these ideas as well.
Mm.
And I don't know how much teacher training goes into this aspect of things. I know SEL is much more prominent as an area of professional development than it was perhaps back in the day. I'm just going to ask if we could explore for a second how to get from teachers knowing about it to implementing it,
Oh,
because I was a health teacher for years and it was always hard to know. And I taught specifically about relationships, and we did, little role plays, and kids would talk about, oh, he doesn't mind, or just kidding, or things like that about, teasing. And I talked about bullying and the whole 9 yards. And I always wondered, how do you measure whether they have actually
mm,
taken it on board? It's so tough. I felt as though they might understand it when they were 30 and looking back on their middle school experience. My son said the same thing. He struggled so much in middle school with relationships and feeling comfortable. And
yes.
he eventually went on to study psychology and took a master's and everything. And then at some point in there, he said to me, I know that in middle school, we're told to just be ourselves and people will
Yes.
like us and be comfortable around us. And yet, at the time, I didn't have the perspective and the capacity to understand what that really meant and looked like. I didn't even know
Mm,
who I was myself. So, how do you be yourself when you don't know who you are? And
yes.
I always thought that was a really interesting perspective. How do you get kids to really get on board with it? Do you have anything else to add in that area?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that you just said that really get me thinking. And one of them is the teacher's own experience. And you made the point earlier in asking the question, does the teacher's sense of belonging, does that have any impact on the student's sense of belonging? And I think that's the starting point for you in entering a school space is, do I feel like I belong here as a teacher? But let's make that a little bit more explicit. And so, sort of thinking of you from your own perspective, Audrey, or from your own perspective, David, when you walk into a place, and let's take it out of schools, let's just make it a social situation. When you walk into a place, entering a room, let's say it's a party or some kind of social gathering, what are some things that make you feel like you belong? I'll put that question out there, not just rhetorically, but we can go ahead and dive into that a little bit. What are the things that people are doing, or the language that they're using, or even the people who are there? What are some things that make you feel like you either belong or maybe that you don't belong? What are some things that people can do for you in order to make you feel like you belong?
Yeah, excellent question. For me, it would be recognizing someone
Yeah.
and failing that if it's a place where I don't know anybody. Wouldn't it be wonderful for someone to turn and say, hi, welcome, who are you? And just really sincerely, and this is maybe the part that's a little hard in middle school, because I'm thinking to those kids that we asked to be, a buddy for a new student. And yeah, you're bringing them along. Like you said, they're included, they're allowed to sit at your lunch table, but they don't really belong
Yeah.
until. So I think that overture is super important, and connecting in areas. So when you say, okay, so what music do you like? Oh, we like the same, niche kind of music, something like that. So those are some things. David, what do you want to say about that?
I was going to say those too, just like you're saying, the commonality of some interest. And the welcome is so huge. And as a Southerner, and that was growing up, you walk into any situation, the elders in the home are going to be welcoming you in and checking on how you're doing. It was just a part of life. I was explaining to someone the other day, I'm, folks are listening right here. So I'm wearing a baseball cap because I had to go to the doctor and get a little things cut out of my forehead because too much sun when I was a kid. So I'm wearing a baseball cap. But I was explaining to a friend here, I feel so uncomfortable. We were in a restaurant wearing a cap because that goes against my tradition. A Southerner would never wear a cap in a restaurant or a church or anything like that. So it is that sense of welcoming, that commonality, and are there some interests there that we can chat about?
Oh, that's so interesting because you, David, are bringing up a whole other aspect of this too, that there is this cultural aspect of belonging. And I think about taking a group of high school students from Amsterdam to London, and there are some different norms around dress and etiquette at restaurants in certain parts of London than there are at certain parts of Amsterdam. And so I remember being there with a fellow teacher from London, and one of our students had a hat on, like you mentioned. And that was definitely not something that was allowed to happen in that particular restaurant where we were. And it's something that I didn't pick up on because I had gotten so used to everything being a little less formal with dress in some of the social situations that I had been in. But yeah, there's that cultural component too of what's allowed and what's not allowed. Audrey, you mentioned how do we work this whole belonging thing with middle school? And that to me gets to this sort of bigger question of who in schools feels like they do belong and who in schools feels like they don't belong. And that probably is an oversimplification because I'm not sure that it's always quite that black or white or static. But are we at least asking the question of our students? We collect a lot of data on academic achievement and academic performance, and how is a student doing on this measure of language proficiency or math proficiency? How often do we ask our students intentionally and track it? Do you feel like you belong here? Do you feel like you have a strong relationship with at least one adult in this school? Do you feel like you have a strong relationship with at least one peer in this school? And if we started to be a little bit more systematic and intentional about how we designed the data collection process in schools, then I think we might be able to come up with some data that speaks to whether or not students feel like they belong in the places that we've created. For me, going back to being a choir teacher and working with choirs of various ages, I always, especially early on in my career, wanted to be focused specifically and wholly on music making and bringing children into beautiful experiences, making music together and making beautiful music together. And for me, that focus was on the act of making music, and that was the important thing. And I think as I have investigated belonging more and spent more time living with the experience of making music together as a group, to me, the musical outcomes are still very, very important. I want to be making beautiful music with my students, but the sense of belonging that they get by experiencing that space and time together, to me, is so incredibly valuable that, like, I can't even hardly think about having that conversation of which is more important. Is it the music that we're making or the feeling that we get while we're making the music together? Which one's more important? Because it might be important in different reasons on different days for different people. You might point to it and say, you know what? This was the one place where I felt like I belonged in school today. Or, man, that was a really incredible piece of music that we all made together. And those are both two awesome statements and outcomes from experiencing music. But I think music is just one of those places where students can have a space to feel like they belong if that happens. For the student that I talked about earlier, in working with other math students, or for my kids on their soccer team, are there places where students can feel like they belong in the school? So yeah, this conversation. And then the other thing that it sort of reminded me about was how important language is in our institutions. And so you both mentioned if someone approached you and greeted you and said, hello, and brought you into that space, that would increase your sense of belonging. And that makes me also think of, what about our students who are coming in who don't speak English, who are learning English? How do they feel like they belong or don't belong or somewhere on that spectrum of belonging? And are we measuring that? And I don't know of many schools that would think to ask their ELL students right from the beginning, do you feel like you belong? How do you feel like you belong? And be able to track that as they learn English. That's a really interesting question, I think, and a really interesting challenge for schools. I think sometimes schools can be really positive places, but sometimes there's a component of false positivity to it. Like we have the inability to admit when we have a problem or an issue. And this whole conversation of belonging, sometimes we don't want to admit that there are people inside of our schools who feel like they don't belong here. And that's a really difficult thing to, hold that mirror up to ourselves and say, yeah, there are kids in our schools who don't like coming to school. There are kids in our schools who don't have strong connections with their peers. There are kids at our schools who don't see themselves in their teachers or their leaders. And there are kids at our schools who can't name an adult who they think cares for them. So what are we doing about it is the next question I think that we have to ask ourselves. What are we doing in order to identify those kids, to be able to say, yeah, we know we have a problem with this particular individual child, that there's an issue here where they don't feel like they belong, or we know we have a problem to solve with a group of students who might feel marginalized or excluded from the school.
I'm glad you raised the question of language, because I also was imagining if I walked into that room and someone tried to welcome me and I didn't understand what they were saying, what that experience would be like.
Right.
It instantly, it would diminish the whole welcome.
Yeah. It would change your perception of whether or not you felt like you belonged there, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And thank goodness for body language. But, and then the other thing that was popping in my head was the person who could oversee this kind of thing would be David, the wellness coordinator. This is what David aspires to bring into schools, is a whole integrated wellness concept where belonging would be a big part of that for sure, because it impacts so many other things that
Right.
happen. And so I'm really glad we're having this conversation. And what we've been talking about with the cultural piece, the language piece, and the belonging piece definitely connect with a person's identity. So when we look at international schools specifically, because so far we've really been talking about some broader school topics, how is a person's identity as an international student different from an identity as a student in someone's home country? And, particularly with your 12-year-olds, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, that's a question that we could dive into for, I think, more time than this podcast allows us to dive into. But, you walk into a space, and depending on where that space is, you may want certain aspects of your identity to be recognized and seen, and you may want other aspects of your identity to be more hidden and private, depending on where you are. I'm thinking of my own perspective as a gay male. There are certain places in the world where I don't lead with the fact that I'm a gay male because I don't feel safe doing that. And certain places where that's not okay. And as sad as that makes me to say that out loud, I recognize that aspects of my identity, some of them remain hidden. And then some of them I feel more comfortable to be authentic about and say, yes, this is me. And belonging definitely has a relationship to identity, in the sense that, are we inviting people to show up authentically? Are we inviting them to show up, that idea that we brought up of fit earlier? Are we inviting them to show up in ways that only fit with our ideal of how people should show up at school? That's I think, a question that unearths a lot of these questions about identity. And so if you think of yourself as being from a particular place, or belonging to a certain religion or race, or speaking a certain language, or having physical ability or disability, or speaking a certain language, or having a certain experience prior to, maybe if you're a teacher, an employment experience, or maybe if you're a student of where you went to school prior, all of those things are different aspects and components of identity. And they're multiple and they're intersecting. meaning that they play out in different ways in different circumstances. And sometimes we might lead with certain elements of our identity, and sometimes we might hide certain elements of our identity. But in school, again, we don't want to be bastions of false positivity, but I think we picture ourselves and we want schools to be places where someone can show up as they are at school. And this is one of the notions that I think we really have to interrogate. Is it really true that for students who show up, that we want them to show up authentically as they do and bring all of their intersecting and complex identities with them? Sometimes we say, yes, absolutely. But then the policies, communication practices, languages that we use, curriculum doesn't align with that desire. So again, we have to interrogate, what do we mean when we say, yes, show up as you are? Does that really mean, yes, show up as you are, as long as you fit our description of what we think you should be?
Wow. So, first of all, thank you for sharing that. That's got to be really tough to feel like you have to sometimes not reveal part of your identity in a situation. It sort of made me think about one aspect of what you mentioned for belonging is, do they have an adult that they feel they connect with? And one way for that to happen for example, gay students would be to have a teacher who can identify as gay openly. And it's really unfortunate that that can be problematic in
Yeah.
some places. So then where do those kids get that feeling, that connection, and I'm feeling sad, honestly,
Yeah.
to know that that's a thing.
And I think that there are lots of things that we can point to and be really proud of in international schools as far as the diversity of our communities. But to paraphrase an administrator that I worked for early in my international teaching career, who said, we're diverse in a very narrow way. And I think that there's a lot of linguistic diversity. We recognize that international schools are schools where students speak a lot of languages. There's ethnic diversity. People feel like their ethnic backgrounds are mixed and they're coming from lots of different places. Is there socioeconomic diversity? We're a little bit less certain about that. We feel that that could be a place where we don't see a broad representation of a lot of different socioeconomic statuses. So I think there are some things that we can look at and point to in international schools where it's like, well, yeah, if you are a student who has these identities, it's probably pretty easy for you to find a role model. But if you're a student who has these identities, it may not be as easy for you to find a role model. I think part of that conversation has to do with how staffing happens, how recruiting for teachers and leadership positions works in international schools. I know that several students that I have talked to have pointed that out when thinking of their own belonging, that the faculty and leadership of a school in a lot of cases are far less diverse than the student body is. And so if you are a Indian female identifying bisexual going to school in Hong Kong, as one of my research participants was, it might be really hard to see yourself in a leader at that school. There might be aspects of your identity that you question, like, how am I ever going to be successful? I don't see anybody who is successful who shares these attributes that I identify closely with. And so I think that that's something for international schools to really think about, and maybe even go past thinking about and start to take some action, some concrete steps to say, we need to examine how we do staffing and who we elevate, whose voices we center as we have conversations about who should fill leadership posts and what those people look like. So there's a bigger conversation to be had, I think, about identity in international schools and what that looks like.
Well, I'm hopeful. I think the tide is starting to turn. And as we know, education as an institution is like an ocean liner. It doesn't turn very quickly. And I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I think I am too. I'm hopeful that we are at least asking the questions that we need to be asking now. And there are a lot of people who are working on changing some of the structures that we've set up in schools that might limit who's visible and how they're visible, but there's still a ways to go. I mean, for me, when my kids were born, it became a lot harder to closet myself. I couldn't go into a school with a husband who also worked at the school and two kids who attended the school and pretend that my family didn't exist. And so even the act of putting my family's picture on my desk was in some ways an act of coming out in a way that other maybe heterosexual teachers never had to think about disclosing an aspect of their identity that way. But then B sometimes felt like an act of protest too, to say that I recognize that schools have been traditionally structured to enforce heteronormative values, and my family's sort of in its existence stands in opposition to some of those heteronormative values. And so even something as innocuous as putting up my picture on my desk with my family is an act of protest and an act against what we may have perceived as normal before.
As a consumer of current events and a previous social studies teacher, I sadly have to say, welcome back to America, where at least in one state, you would get in trouble for doing that. You would not be
Right.
allowed to do that. All right. So I did want to bring up connecting to the SEL and the wellness. So we're looking at this pathway, especially time and space and interaction in the community. And at the same time, there's the parallel pathway that's, to use your word, intersecting of the personal growth of each individual and helping them learn who they are. That's the normal thing we do in schools, but we're kind of waking up that we need to do a much, much better job in helping students understand who they are, where can they fit in, how can they fit in. And so these two pathways are weaving together, intersecting as they go forward through the K-12 experience. In a moment, we're going to ask you about strategies and such that schools can do. But I just wanted to bring that up to our listeners, that this is a very dynamic situation, working with the individuals, but also working with the structures and the systems within the school and then the community, if you can have that kind of outreach. So we're asking you these big, tough questions and you're handling them so well, but what are some positive and negative forces affecting international students as they develop their identities? And when we look at international students, we've talked a lot about it on previous episodes. A lot of our international kids are home country kids in bilingual schools. And then they're the kids who are actively moving with their families. And then they're the kids in the local communities that are not from that place. But maybe a few takeaways of what does it mean to be an international student, and what are the things helping them with their identities, and what are some of the barriers?
Right. What an important question. And I think that you, just in setting up that question, have uncovered one of the most challenging things about answering that question, which is all international schools are not the same. And especially, I think, in the last 10, 15 years, you've seen a huge explosion in international schools that are international because of the curriculum that they teach or because of their approach to education, but may look less international in the sense that the student body population might be more local, more indigenous to the area where the international school is. And so that creates a different set of challenges than a school with a very transient population. Because I think one of the things that is challenging for the schools where students are moving in and out every 2 or 3 years is that you have students who are in transition all the time. And for them, especially if you're considering belonging as related to time and place, I haven't spent much time there and it's a new place. And so that makes it really difficult to feel like I belong. One student that I talked to said, who feels like they belong in a new school? And I think that that's a great question, because the answer probably is not many people walk into a space and say, yes, I'm so excited to be going to this school. I feel like I belong here right from the beginning. And I think, even in the best of situations where schools have really great onboarding and welcoming processes, you still have that really awkward transition where you're figuring out who you are and how you interact with the new people in this new place. It's a really difficult time. I think about, the transition that my kids have gone through in the last year of transitioning from an international school. And they've gone to that international school from the time they were in nursery, so age 2.5, all the way till they were in 5th grade. And that's been their entire schooling experience. And now they're moving for the first time into a public school setting in the USA. And I have to say, the public school where we attend did a phenomenal job of welcoming the students into the.
Hooray!
Yeah, it was great. It was really good. And still, it's a tough transition. It's not an easy needle to thread. It was hard. And I think this sort of brings up another point about what makes international schools a little bit different. My kids spoke the language, first of all, they speak English. And so they didn't have that barrier of trying to communicate with the people around them. And then also, we have a pretty good support structure in this area because it's an area where I grew up and where we have family. And so we knew sort of where to access resources. We knew where to get them involved into the community. They had family nearby that they can, for the first time in their lives, actually go visit their grandparents and, spend the night there and see their cousins and have family members come to their soccer games. That's been a really amazing thing. Okay, well, you think about the international student who might be moving from place to place, and they may not have access to those same kinds of resources and social supports that a student might have wherever they're from. And so that creates a particular challenge because the international school then might occupy a very, maybe exclusively central location in that student's life. And I think back to some of the experiences that I've had in international schools where I've worked, where I've walked through the cafeteria. And when I walk through the cafeteria, what do I see? At any point of the day where they're not serving lunch, I have seen parents standing and socializing with each other, or the cafeteria of the school is a central meeting space, not just for the students but for the whole community. And that international school occupies that sort of central social function. It takes up just an inordinate amount of space in the lives of people. That school, when you are an American student going to an American public school, may not take up quite as much space as an international school does as far as the level of importance goes. So I had one student that said to me, if your experience as an international school student is positive, it's probably really positive. But if it's negative, it's probably sort of soul crushingly negative because that's all you have. You don't have family around you. You don't have the ability to blend in with the local culture because of maybe a language barrier or because you look different than the people that are around you, or for whatever other reason that there's some barriers to being able to blend in with what's around and access social support structures. So there are definitely particular challenges that international school students face that are related to your experience of being in transition, your experience of being somewhere new, maybe not speaking a language that everybody else speaks, or not looking like everybody else looks too.
So back to the high school kids, and I'm going to do a huge generalization about international schools, that in general, there's a real focus on academic achievement. And some places it's extreme, right? A levels, IB, full diploma,
Sure.
AP, all that. So I wonder what it's like with all that academic pressure, and at the same time for these young people continuing to try to figure out who they are and where they belong. And I'm not going to open the can of worms about the social networking and the world of technology, in some ways, I guess, connecting people, but in so many ways, disconnecting people and causing struggles, as Jonathan Haidt's doing a lot of research on that, among others. But I wonder what, in general, it's like for high school students in high academic international schools. Do you have any data on that group?
My own research didn't speak to that particular idea. Now, anecdotally, because of the work that I do, working with students who are, in a lot of cases, high flyers at their schools, there's so much pressure that they're under, both from themselves that they place sort of internally on themselves, but then also from parents and then from the school in order to achieve that. You think about what's the parameters that they're allowed to exist by. They feel supported, accepted, respected, and included as long as they fulfill this particular function, going back to our basic definition of belonging. And I think maybe that's just another illustration of, it's really important for us to be able to identify where do people feel like they don't belong amongst a number of other wellness indicators. One of those might be the question of relationships. Do you feel like you have a good relationship with a peer? Do you feel like you have strong relationships with your teachers? And are we asking that in a systematic way, not just for our kids who are high flyers, but for all of our kids who may or may not feel like they fit into the academic situation of their school? And what way are we collecting that data? And then what are we doing with it?
Absolutely. You need a starting point. You need to consistently look at your progress. You need to know what you're dealing with. So that makes a lot of sense with the data collection. So, wondering as we dig into that a little, what kind of programs and maybe specific strategies school leaders and teachers can design, implement to improve the environments inside and outside the classroom in supporting students' well being so that they feel supported and connected to others?
Right. That's a great question. I want to point to a couple of different things. And the first one is, in general, the programs and strategies that nurture human connection. And I think, particularly having been a teacher in systems that really put a lot of emphasis on assessment and assessment schedules, particularly where there's an external exam that students are preparing for, sometimes it seems like everything in our academic calendar is leading up to when's the exam and what's going to be on the exam. And so that kind of assessment driven calendar, like everything that lies around the assessment, removes a couple of things. It removes the ability of the teacher to be responsive to students' needs. If everything is sort of moving toward, we have to assess you on these things at this particular time, then the calendar and the learning becomes about that assessment rather than meeting the students where they are and finding out what their needs are. So I would say, thinking about programs and strategies, how can we mitigate that kind of sort of, we know that there are going to be exams, we know that there are going to be assessments, and I'm not really saying that we should remove all of those, but what I am saying is, how are we designing for and including the ability of teachers to be responsive to student needs in the lead up to the exams, in the learning experiences of the classroom? So thinking from a student perspective, when do they get to stop and say to a teacher, wait, I don't understand this, we need to go back and do this again? Or when do I get to say, hey, I think I've got this, but the way that we were able to show this learning didn't really work for me. I think I could show it better if I did this instead. Or when do I get to go back and say, I wasn't ready for this at this point, but I'm ready for it now, and I need to have this learning right now. It's the right time for it. Those kinds of experiences push up against the one that says, well, the exam's on May 15th, and that's when the exam is, and this is the timetable that you're on for learning. There's a great video by Sal Khan where he talks about the nature of redefining time and space in schools. It's really, really challenging, because what we've been doing for the long time has been saying, we're going to go from point A to point C in this amount of time. And if you don't get there, then we're going to go from point D to point F. Rather than saying, oh, wait, you didn't get A through C, so let's talk about that. Let's continue to unpack that. No, we're just going to continue going right on. And if you had a deficit before, well, now you're really going to have a deficit afterward, because we don't have time to respond to what your actual situation is. So that's one place to start. What are the ways that we are intentionally nurturing human connection? Secondly, I think that how students see themselves in the curriculum is really important. Is the curriculum inclusive of the lived experiences of many different kinds of people? Or do our curriculums point to the lived experiences of a few people that are selected and centered in our narratives that we tell in schools? And usually the ones that we want students to be like this. We want students to act this way. If students can show up to school this way, then we're good with that, and we can include these people. Well, let's interrogate that a little bit and see, who is asked to show up in our curriculum, and does it match who we invite to show up in our schools? The third thing I think we can point to as far as putting in some strategies for teachers is activating student agency. What are the ways that, from the youngest age to the oldest age, that students feel that their voice has an intentional impact on their education? In other words, like I said earlier, is their education is something being done to them or something that they have power to affect as they navigate through it, whether that's in determining how they're going to show their learning, or choosing what that learning is, or going at their speed instead of the speed of the assessment. There's any sort of number of factors where we can push back. And I want to pause here for a second, because these sound like really bedrock principles of school that I'm talking about shaking up a little bit. And so we have a tendency, when we talk about those kind of things, to flip into this binary of like, oh, it either has to be the way it was or the way it's always been, or I have to blow school up entirely. and I can't be anywhere in between those two. So I either have to be completely and totally revolutionizing school, or we just do business as usual. And there's no way for us to take subtle, smaller, or maybe even steps and shifts toward the way we want it to be, maybe in recognizing that we're not there yet. We're on a continuum. We're moving in sort of this journey and progression. And Audrey, you mentioned earlier, for teachers and teacher training, how do we get teachers on board with creating spaces of belonging? I think part of that journey is helping teachers reflect on what are some of the strategies that they're already employing that create spaces of belonging for their students. I think almost every teacher that I've ever worked with, they have an instinct about them of like, yes, this is working with students. You can ask a teacher, what's your favorite thing you do with students in your classroom? And they'll be able to tell you, and they'll be able to tell you how joyful the students are, or how they respond to the particular lesson or a particular experience that they have. But then let's dig into that a little bit further. Why are they joyful? Why are they experiencing this moment of educational bliss? Why are they experiencing it at that particular time? And then help teachers lean into those kind of experiences and realize that, yes, there are things that I'm just sort of instinctively doing that create spaces of belonging for my students, and then help them magnify those and be more intentional about them, so that we're not just sort of intuitively creating spaces of belonging, but we're intentionally creating spaces of belonging for the students that we have in our classrooms. And then lastly, as far as this program and strategies question goes, I'd like to think about who's in the room and how they feel about who's in the room. So what are the mechanisms that we have in place in our classrooms to ask students how they're feeling, who they're connecting with, and to help them create relationships with each other? So things that even as the students are engaging in group work, is their group work designed into your curriculum? And how do we scaffold that group work for students? I think so often, especially as I was encountering middle school students who were emerging from a very play heavy elementary classroom, which was great as far as setting them up of being able to work with each other. But then they need some advanced strategies for being able to do group work with students, because a lot of the times the group work defaulted to divide and conquer. Okay, group work means you do this part, I do this part, and you do this part. But what if group work started from a position of let's learn how to relate to each other, and let's learn more about how to connect with each other as human beings, and then we can learn what superpowers we each have, and then we can start to work in a way that accents and elevates those superpowers in our group, so that we are really collaborating on something that, instead of we're dividing and conquering in order to get something done, we're actually collaborating to create something that the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts if we were all doing this individually.
I really key in on your point of take a look at what's working as an instructional coach. That's how I would always start.
Yeah.
And then also have teachers comment on what their fellow teachers are doing that they're just not aware of. And then, like you're saying, start building on that. And it just popped in my head. I worked with Jeremy Neldon at my last school, and he did Democratic class meetings, second grade. And I went in for a few of those, and I was wearing socks when I walked in, and they were knocked off by the time I left. Just to see the voices, the agency,
Yep.
and they were discussing what they wanted to do in the day, when would math be or whatever, but they also were talking about interactions and how they felt about their interactions. And so that's a giant mechanism right there that he was sharing with other teachers and trying to get that rolling. But there's so many that are out there for people to look at each other's classrooms and learn and see what you can adapt for your classroom.
One of my favorite things to ask students after a unit was, what's one thing that you would have me continue doing? What's one thing that you would have me do more of? And what's one thing that you want me to stop doing as a teacher? And so that opportunity for them to give me feedback both gave me insight into them as a student, but then also, especially if I would follow up and actually be responsive to their feedback, would sort of build trust for them as a student, for me as a teacher. They would trust me more because my focus in asking that question is on wanting to be the best teacher I can for you. So it's really about you and who you are and where you are in your learning. And so I think that, like you're saying, in observing the democratic classroom, those intentional ways that we can design to connect to students and elevate their voices are the things that make them feel like they belong in our classrooms.
All right. You have provided such breadth and depth. And so let's take a dive into what your dissertation was on. You're sharing so much expertise, and that's our mission to bring people like you on and to share that knowledge. And you've put a lot of time and effort into looking at gender and sexual minorities in our schools. And again, another one of these topics you could speak to for a long time. But what are some highlights from your findings that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think just like international schools are all very different from each other, gender and sexual minority students are also different from each other in a lot of different ways, including how they feel like they belong in our schools. And so some students, especially those that are transgender, typically feel like they belong less than other students, maybe gay or lesbian students. And so it's not the same for all students. Their experiences that they have as they enter into schools and what they have as they move through schools can look and feel very different one from another. So again, this gets to the question of, are we aware as school leaders and as educators who might be having a difficult time and who's doing fine? And asking that question and then going to find out the answer might feel really different from one set of students, one group of students to the other. I want to point to a couple of things that we've said already and just sort of recontextualize them into this conversation about gender and sexual minority students. First of all, the centrality of the role of the international school and that it plays in the lives of students, and thinking of that from the perspective of a gender or a sexual minority student, students might not feel connected, accepted, respected, included, or supported by anyone in the local community where the school is. And so for them, the school might be the best chance that they have of feeling a sense of belonging. They might not be able to participate in community activities around the school in the same way that heterosexual or cisgender students might be able to participate. And they may not have a robust support system like some other students have, including their immediate family. I think in my research, I talked to one student who was a transgender student who was in Turkey, and her family did not support her as a transgender student. And so the only support that she was receiving was from a couple of teachers at the school. And she was also faced with very misogynist, very transphobic views of a lot of members in that community too. So it was a really challenging, school was a really challenging experience for her. The other thing I think to keep in mind too is that these issues of gender and issues of sexual orientation are hardly ever in isolation. So they're usually almost always accompanied by other identity factors such as race and language that students speak. So I think in particular about one student who, her mother was German and her father was Chinese, and she was attending a school in Germany. And the other students, or her perception of the other students, was that they didn't view her as German and they didn't view her as Chinese. And she was bisexual. All of these identities on top of each other just created issues of difficulty understanding who she was and how she fit into her community and figuring out where she could belong. So race issues, our gender issues, our sexual orientation issues, they're all mixed up with each other. And it's really hard to separate them all out. I think the third thing I would point to that is particularly challenging in some international school contexts is something that we've talked about a little bit already, and that's the element of the culture around the school. So not within the school, but where is the school situated in the world? And we are all well aware that in certain places in the world, my family, we lived in Amsterdam and we were treated almost like any other family. And despite the fact that we were a family with two gay dads, but if you would put us into a different cultural context, we could have been not only sort of culturally ostracized, but then also maybe legally not allowed to be there, as indicated by, I've had, like I said before, administrators say to me, well, all it would take to get you to our school is one of you give up your parental rights. Well, that's not really a possibility for us. So the homophobic and transphobic views can seriously negatively impact the experience of gender and sexual minority students in international schools, depending on where they are. And that, I think, in particular, is a topic that we can go into in much greater detail because, as you peel away the layers of, well, why is this particular culture perceived as homophobic or transphobic? And is there a colonization element to that? Or is there an idea of like we're painting the whole culture with one brush when really it's much more nuanced than what it is? So I realized that the risk of having this conversation at all is that I can't bring the level of detail to it in a short form podcast that it actually deserves. But this is complicated by a lot of different factors. But the cultural element and where the school is situated is definitely one that can impact the experience of gender and sexual minority students attending an international school.
Right. And when you stop, or I stop right now, and I'm thinking, let's say you're at the end of the continuum where it's a really big international school with kids from all over, and
Yeah.
you're trying to swim in an ocean with tides and rip tides and everything going all these different directions. Some of it good, some of it not so good, some of it people who are maybe fighting their culture of the past to try to be in the present. And then they go home and potentially talk to their parents, and then it all collapses when they talk about their friend who's trying to figure some things out. Complexity comes into play so much. And then you've got the culture outside the school, what's
Yes.
going on there as well. So very dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to gender and sexual minorities, there's some disconnect between the school's policies and curricula and school's mission and values, where we say in our mission and values, we're a lovingly, wonderful, incredibly accepting community, except for that we don't want you to talk about being non-binary as a teacher because we feel like that sexualizes a space that we perceive as not sexual. When in reality, it's already sexualized by the fact that we continually reinforce sort of a heteronormative binary between you are either straight or you're gay or you're a man or you're a woman. And those are the ways that we feel comfortable talking about sexuality and sexual orientation. And the minute that we start to uncover that there are other ways to talk about it, then we get really uncomfortable and we start to back away from, well, we're a lovingly, wonderful, accepting community, except for when you start to talk about things that we really don't want to talk about it because we feel like it sexualizes the space that we have already sexualized in a way that we're comfortable with.
Wow, that's so true. And that wasn't something that was automatically apparent
Yeah.
to me. And so I really appreciate you coming in with a very different perspective and highlighting that. And it makes so much sense.
And I recognize also in saying that's a bit scary for school leaders because it really does require school leaders to have some courage to say, if our space is inclusive, if our space is truly supportive of all students, then it requires us to understand how students need to be supported. I remember having a conversation with a school leader about supporting gender and sexual minority students. And when I asked a question of like, how do you specifically support this population that is so frequently ostracized and marginalized in schools? And the response I got back was, oh, well, we love and support all students. And it's like, well, that's great. I'm so glad that you do. And unless you're recognizing that students need to be supported in different ways, then I'm not sure that you have the practice and intentionality of the design of your structures and programs in order to back up the sentiment that we love and support all students.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering if maybe you can share a couple of strategies that you are aware of for helping people who are processing gender and sexual identities.
Yeah. So the first one I think is the importance of acknowledgement and acknowledging that we see you for who you are and we invite you to show up in this space. And that can take a lot of different forms of you don't ever want to, out a particular student, but we want to be able to create a safe space where a student can talk about their identity in ways that they're comfortable talking about their identity. That may be with a counselor, that may be with one teacher, that may be with a group of peers. But the idea is, are we creating a space where we acknowledge who the student is and we support them because of it and not in spite of it? That's one. And then the second thing is, and this was another part of my research that I did, which spoke to the idea of authenticity in leadership. And I would characterize leadership sort of broadly. Here, educators, every time you step into your classroom, you're a leader, you're an educational leader. So, not thinking of leadership just as administration, but are we promoting and celebrating leadership in schools from educators and from administrators that is an authentic representation of their identities, whether those are ethnic identities or sexual orientation identities or gender identities? Are we creating spaces where if you do have a bisexual school principal, is it okay that they are allowed to say, I'm bisexual in this space? Or is it okay for me as a leader in a school to put the picture of my very queer family on my desk at school? In what ways are we promoting that authenticity of our school leaders? And in doing so, creating the possibility that students can see themselves in successful leadership within the school.
Yes, that power of trust. And when we interview folks, we talk about smaller, very community focused schools, and they're also the very large ones as well that can be very community focused as well. But I wonder, it's been a while since I've been at a small school, the schools that have that true authenticity, that have that trust, that it's not a facade of you've got the mission on the wall, but you can see it in practice every day.
I worked with a fantastic educator who taught next door to me for several years. And one of her sayings was, if it's laminated, it's dead. And I love that saying because those mission statements and vision statements, we have the tendency to want to laminate them and put them up on the walls. And the moment I think that you do, it's a dead statement. It's not living and breathing, because if it's living and breathing, then it's going to be messy, but it's going to be constantly evolving, and we're going to be constantly having conversations and adding to it. And so the idea of something laminated and finished up on the wall versus, okay, here's this big piece of Post-it paper and we're going to write out, this is our mission. And now we're going to keep adding to it of how our mission lives in what we do every day and what we need to do in order to keep this mission alive and at the center of our work. This is not something that's static. It's something that is the ongoing, sort of constantly deferred work of establishing the culture of our school. The moment that we think we've got it, check mark, done, laminated it on the wall, is the moment I think that we fall into maybe the pitfalls of school being for a limited and narrow group of people, be it teachers, parents, students, rather than an inclusive space where we're taking into account people's differences and responding to their needs.
And right there, I use the term checklist culture. I've worked at a few of those schools. They're very systematic, they're very orderly, they're very logical, but there's not a heart at the center.
Yeah.
And it's a checklist. So that is brilliant. I love that idea of this truly living, and some schools put up the walls where you can have the chalk and write it up. And I love that idea. So good on you.
So Douglas, honestly, you've really given me a lot to think about here. And I really hope that our listeners are also looking at their own practice and first thinking what they're doing well to include their students and give them a sense of belonging. When you think about the importance of it, I think if we tie back into what you said at the beginning about Maslow's hierarchy, kids or people who don't feel comfortable in their space and don't have that sense of belonging can't achieve those higher order levels of thinking. It's just not possible. And so it's vital that we really, as you say, hold up a mirror and dig into what are we doing and what could we be doing better in supporting students in this way. Thank you so much for bringing this very, very rich and personal conversation to the table.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, so glad to be invited to have this conversation. Audrey, what you just said, I think is really important, that, educators are already doing so many things so well that they're creating spaces every day where students can show up as they are with all of their intersecting and multiple identities and be acknowledged, be accepted, be respected, be included, be supported. And we need to continue to make that a goal for schools in general and ask the really tough questions of ourselves. What are the things that are happening in our school that make people feel uninvited, unincluded, maybe disrespected, or not asked to show up at how they are? And then continue to work to deconstruct those and replace them with ways that we want school to be for all students.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.